Menopause, Marriage and Motherhood, a podcast that's all about changing the way we view midlife and bringing the conversation about menopause out into the open. Each week we share stories, experiences, tips and inspirations. We talk to experts on how to best navigate this time of life and how to have as much fun as we can. Now here's your host, Karen O'Connor.
I'm here today with Erica Bowen, who is a psychologist, a coach, and Imagineer of the Hope Makers. Now, I met Erica because I was looking for somebody who could come on the podcast and talk about toxic relationship. Is there a way that people can spot somebody who's toxic? Is that obvious, or is it mainly from the outside we go, oh yeah, that's not
It's so interesting because you always get groups that will say, if you've got a high profile, goes, oh, well, clearly, when you look at his characteristics, it was clear that this was going to happen this way. Hindsight is 20/20 vision. And it's so hard because what we know is that we get these things, called illusory correlations, where we look in anything and we assume that these two things are linked and therefore forecastable or predictable. Risk assessment is really hard and it's not an exact science. Even when you're using kind of scientifically derived tools, it's not easy and it's not always right. And like I said, what we do know is that a woman's perception of the likelihood of her being re-abused is as accurate as standard risk assessment tools. So, the first thing that we could be doing is speaking with and at least believing the women who are saying that they're scared, because the likelihood is they are, and with good reason. That's what we know. I think there are characteristics of toxic relationships, and some of those patterns are around people kind of like moving in together really, really quickly. You suddenly go, wow, you've only been together like 2 weeks and now you're living together. That's really interesting, because what's driven that? And sometimes it's completely innocuous. And this is the other thing, is that from an outside perspective, you can also over assume risk where there is none, because you're not in the relationship, and that's a difficult dynamic. But when you look at kind of like characteristics of abusive relationships, sometimes, a pattern is that men tend to be quite a few years older than the women. There is that quite an interesting age disparity. But yeah, it's that sense of things moving very, very quickly, moving in together very, very quickly. A man becoming very much part of a woman's life very deeply, very quickly would be something that I would be kind of going, that's interesting. What is that actually about? Because it's not usually the way relationships work, and it doesn't have, again, it can exist and not be abusive either. And I think that's a real difficult one. I think the moment that somebody's behavior seems to change once they're in a new relationship, so if they are wearing different things that they wouldn't normally wear, or if they are talking about being given permission to do things in any way, shape or form, was like, oh yeah, no, he told me it was fine for me to come. You'd be like, okay, that's interesting, because actually, why, do we need to give each other permission? Yes, you can say, I'm going out tonight. Is it okay if I go out tonight? Is an interesting question, because why wouldn't it be okay if you're in an equal and loving relationship? Yeah, it's fine. You have some level of independence from me. So I think where there seems to be a high level of dependence very quickly in a relationship, or that seeming to be what the case is, you can maybe think and just go, okay, that's interesting. Maybe I need to keep watch a little. And sometimes, most of the time, it will be nothing. And sometimes it will be something. And that's the real difficulty from being an observer. But yeah, if you notice that somebody who was deeply sociable has a very strange change of mood or presence, their energy changes dramatically. If they seem more guarded, but they're not really saying anything and maintaining that everything's fine, but actually you can tell something is going on, then it's probably worth asking those questions. And it might not be that, but something is going on. I think it's about following your gut, because a lot of the time we will pick up, particularly with people that we know, those really subtle changes. And it could be that they are dismissed. And, and all the likelihood is they will be dismissed, because would anybody want to acknowledge the fact that actually their relationship isn't really working out the way they want it to, or they're being made to feel as they're going crazy, or they don't actually feel safe. That requires a huge level of vulnerability, which most people aren't happy with. And the likelihood is you probably won't get an opportunity to be one-to-one with them because of any form of controlling behavior. Because what you'll probably find is they become more and more difficult to reach as a friend. And if that starts to happen, then again, I would be thinking, okay, that's interesting. Yes, friendships fluctuate over time, but it's only been since he was around or she was around. So it can be very, very subtle.
Going back to what you were saying about the risk analysis, and the women who come out of it usually can say really accurately how much they're at risk or not. Is implication behind that those women aren't believed, or is the cases of that where they've gone, no, I'm really at risk, and the risk analysis has come back that no, they should be okay?
I think it's an interesting field. So what we have, so if, for example, in that situation, they would be women who are probably going to be involving the criminal justice system, so other professionals. That requires the professionals to understand the dynamics of domestic abuse. Okay, so whilst we have in the UK one kind of main risk assessment that's used by the police, I've conducted research with the police where they tend to go by their gut and override the risk assessment anyway, which is interesting, but actually not necessarily in that way, because they're terrified of the repercussions. So if they get it wrong, they would much rather say something was at greater risk than lower risk, because if they get it wrong, somebody could die. So the police tend to understand the severity potentially of domestic abuse. However, domestic abuse is usually defined as a pattern of behavior. And what you have is a response from the police that is incident based. So unless there is really good data collection and really good recording, then that pattern of behavior, which is there, can be missed. The other difficulty is that at any particular scene of crime, you have two people. And again, what you have is a woman and a man, and the man will likely be behaving in such a way that will make it seem as though the woman was the aggressor. That happens quite a lot. So there's the situational manipulation from the get-go, if they know that the police are present. And one of the most difficult things for police to do is to work out who actually is the aggressor. Now, you could say, well, let's take an educated guess. 1 in 3 women are victims, so let's go with the fact that it's the man that's the aggressor. But they obviously also then have to go by the evidence that's presented at the scene, because they need to then meet the legal requirements of evidence. So again, everything that we would think rationally when it comes down to those procedures may not play out because of the way the scene looks, the evidence that's presented at the scene. So that all of that can then impact on professional perceptions of risk. And also, if you're doing a risk assessment with a victim at that point, she's going to be deeply distressed. She will possibly still have the abusive person in the room, So those dynamics are not going to be potentially as reliable as if she was being interviewed somewhere else where they were separate, where she felt safe.
Why would they interview her with the perpetrator still in the room?
Sometimes just simply because of the pressure of the scene, because they're trying to work out what's going on.
Right.
And that is the difficulty, and every police officer I've spoken to finds domestic abuse cases the most challenging, but they also make up about 60% of the police casework. So it's, and they also can be lethal situations as well, also placing the police at risk. So the risk in that situation when they go to arrest isn't just about the man and the woman potentially that's there, it's about actually the risk to the police as well. So, and invariably a high proportion of those cases in this situation will also be alcohol or drug influenced as well, which then adds a layer of unpredictability to things. So, it's just that kind of, a horrific scenario where you've got lots and lots of layers of risk, not just the risk to the woman, but actually the risk to the police officers, risk to the perpetrator, potentially to himself, by himself. So all of those dynamics that have to be assessed and managed within a situation. I couldn't do it. There's absolutely no way I could be a police officer working around that dynamic, because I think whichever way you work, you probably feel that you're going to get something wrong, because there's so much to try and control and understand in a really dynamic and very, very difficult situation. But it does mean that invariably there are judgments made that are incorrect, because it's not straightforward. at all. The police have been, certainly in the UK over the last few years, there's been a lot of kind of reviews of police procedures, and things have certainly been changing to try and make police responses better. But certainly a few years ago, there were some very, very damaging reviews of police responses to domestic abuse because of the lack of attention to detail, the lack of awareness of actually trying to get that information to meet the legal requirements of the definition of domestic abuse, as it were. And I think we've still got some way to go on that. But you've also got, some incredible domestic violence specialist officers as well, who do an incredible job. So I think it's probably one of the most difficult crimes for police to be involved in because of the nature of the dynamics, the people involved, the fact that actually a lot of the time women will call the police out not because they want their partner to be arrested, but just because they want it to stop now. They want this incident to be stopped. And of course, what you then have is the police response, which is, well, if we're called out, we're here to gather evidence to try and prosecute. But if victims have no other way of trying to control the person that's controlling them, then that's also not going to work either, because their use of the police is not the intended use for the police, as it were. That's not the role that they want the police to act in. And we don't have an intermediary. We don't have any other kind of agency that can kind of come out in that role. So you then have, again, a quite a big disjoint between what victims potentially want from an incident as an outcome and what the police are expected to do as an outcome of an incident. And again, that can lead to certainly variations in reporting and expectations and all other sorts of things about people's perceptions of the policing of domestic abuse as well, because it's not necessarily working in the same way that it would for any other form of crime.
I hadn't even considered that the police are law enforcers, and it's the
Yes.
only way to stop this, but they go in with a mandate to enforce the law.
Yes.
And yet most of the time it might not be a law enforcement issue as such.
Yep. Absolutely. We know that the rates of prosecution for domestic violence are very small, even smaller for rape. But for domestic abuse, I think, the dynamics around the policing of it are very, very different for exactly that reason, because women are trying to gain power in a situation and an incident at that moment where they feel most at risk, not using it because they want their partner to be prosecuted or go to prison. Because again, all of the other stuff, because they're dependent on their partner in some way. They have kids. They don't want to disrupt the family. We have layers of moral reasoning that are still there within all of this. People still want to have a family. They still want to have a family life. They still want to have a semblance of a united family, even within the context of abuse. And all of this can still play into decisions of whether or not they're going to prosecute, whether or not they want to take it forward. But again, from an outsider's perspective, would go, for God's sake, you called the police, just get him taken away. Why on earth would you want him back in your family home? It's like, because it's the dynamic of family, which, is so very different to any other social configuration we have, as a species. It really is, So yeah, I keep saying it. It's very complicated. It really is. There are so many layers to it and so many reasons why people will or will not stay in an abusive relationship. But it's easy to understand why we all, as outsiders, get frustrated by it. But that's simply because we're just not in it, and the best thing we can do is to keep watch, because even if there is a period where any wrongdoing is denied, or it's everything's fine, you can see as a friend something's not fine, then the worst thing we can do as a friend is to then start believing that everything's fine and go, okay, I can see that it's not fine, but you say it's fine, that's all, and kind of distance ourselves, because actually what we need to do is to be there should we be needed, and to be there and go, okay, yeah, I'm here, and if you need me to help, I can help, without your friend, associate feeling they're also going to be judged by you because of the way things have gone for them. So it is hard, but you have to be, I think, mindful of the fact that this stuff can happen, and it can happen regardless of your level of income we know, particularly when financial abuse is involved, there can be incredibly wealthy families where abuse is really at the center of the family dynamic. And again, if you've got a man with high levels of financial resources, when it goes to court, we know who's going to win. Or conversely, money speaks an awful lot to power. So that's always going to be part of the outcome in those kind of things, is going to be the level of financial resourcing available to whichever party. But it can happen regardless of who you are. It's indiscriminate. It's not about wealth. It's not about not having money. It's about human experience and what drives that need to control somebody. And a lot of that can come down to some very deep-seated insecurity. Some of it can come down to having seen stuff like that modeled as a kid. You learn how to treat other people by how you were treated and how you see other people being treated around you. It's usually a combination of many, many things. And sometimes as a psychologist, we'll put people in boxes and go, oh, it's because of a personality disorder. That in a very small minority of cases, that may well play a role. Most of it is a function of socialization and trauma. So, it's learned either directly through trauma or indirectly by other stuff that you've seen and the expectations that have been shaped for you by the people that you've been around.
I want to ask some more questions, but I'm just looking at the time. We've been talking for an hour.
We have.
This is great. I told you this was good. This is going to be good. Yeah, I better wrap it up because my podcasts are usually 40 minutes and I've just still got about 3 more questions I want to ask, but I can't.
You can ask them if you want to. I have time.
What? I always get quite cross when I hear a news report and it says, there was a car crash, 2 people died, but 2 people are uninjured. No, they're not. They cannot possibly come out of a car crash uninjured. How much of this has to do with the only thing we see as being important is physical healthiness, well-being?
Yeah. It's really interesting. So in the UK, we've had some legislation passed around a concept called coercive control. That is to try and foreground the insidious psychological damage that can be caused by overtly controlling behavior. It's still, I was going to say, relatively new. It's been around a few years now. But in terms of prosecutions, we've had very, very few. Again, so it's that kind of similar thing to kind of stalking. So if you have somebody who is pursuing somebody else, and it could be after the end of a relationship, it could not, but they will have a certain dynamic between them where there is stuff that is known and is of significance between them and only them. If you imagine in a relationship, you have a certain level of deep understanding of each other's behaviors, patterns, past, whatever it is, likes and dislikes. So if you are pursuing someone and causing psychological damage, what you can do is then use all of that knowledge against them. For example, leaving a box of eggs outside the front door, if you know that for whatever reason, somebody is, for example, is allergic to eggs or has had a traumatic incident in the past that involved eggs, or, just something that was deeply significant to them, but to a passerby, you'd look and go, it's a box of eggs, for God's sake, how can that be of any significance to you? Whereas what you've got is what seems like a deep overreaction to the presence of this thing. And that's the difficulty, is that actually that meaning is very, very individual, but it's also deeply, deeply meaningful. So, it is a really extraordinary trigger that nobody else can understand. Now, that's the way that psychological abuse works. It's just picking up on the triggers and what is known that can be used and turned against you. And what that can then lead to are then other erratic patterns of behavior in the victim that people don't understand and will try and probably attribute to something else other than it being a product of domestic abuse or coercive control or stalking and harassment, whichever way that is. So it is very, very difficult to deal with something like that. And I think particularly within a legal framework, it's very easy to find evidence around physical violence. If there's a bruise, it's easy to see. If there are, unfortunately, any other form of wounding is easy to at least see that there has been an incident that's occurred. even though we know that when those incidents are viewed as individual incidents, it will decrease the likelihood of domestic abuse being recorded because again, it's just working at an instant basis. But then when you have something that doesn't have a physical presentation, it's much more difficult to detect and much easier to describe as something else. So we do have a very clear bias towards things that are easy to understand, i.e. physical violence, wounding, those really clear signals where we can't get it wrong.
Situation over here at the moment, one of our high level politicians, our former attorney general, he was kind of moved sideways a week or so ago. He's been accused of raping somebody when they were at a debating contest when they were 17. So we're talking a long time ago. She's actually committed suicide. But now more and more women are coming forward with stories of how he's behaved. So there was an incident a few years ago. It wasn't him, it was somebody else, another MP in federal parliament. One woman got up out of a chair and this guy went over and sniffed the chair that she just got up out of. Now,
wow, okay.
That to me is the exact coercive control that you're talking about. There's a pattern of behavior there that is meant to instigate an outcome of the women need to be kept in their place and whatever else is going on in their minds. And it's interesting how difficult the politicians are finding it to actually do anything about it. It's really fascinating.
It always is fascinating. I think it's, again, I mean, if you think about the level of power that he has, the positions of authority that he's been in, the implicit fear that the women would have experienced because of that. There's a lot of silencing that happens that doesn't even have to be said. And that's without his then overt behaviors. But I think it always is very, very difficult for people to know where to start with people in those positions. I think the response globally is changing. I think we are more ready to take it on, but I think there is still so much more to do. So much more to do in getting to a position where we just get that these behaviors are wrong and we don't do them. I mean, it seems so easy to say, doesn't it? But I think it's taken a long time for people to validate women, and then to validate women's experiences is another step that we still need to take without being labeled as being, histrionic or all of the other nonsense that we've grown up with. But when you have somebody in a position of power like that, and the other difficulty is then the other people that have seen those behaviors and said nothing.
That's one of the things that's coming out now is there was a woman who was raped in Parliament in one of the female MPs' offices. And it was reported to the police by a staffer. She was raped by, she was a staffer and raped by this other guy. It was reported to police and basically quashed. They were told to mind their own business. This was about 18 months ago. And then she went public again a few weeks ago, and more women are coming forward and saying the same things happened to me and I got shunted sideways. So they're starting to do something about it. But we've got a long way to go. Especially when our Prime Minister, ScoMo, the Australians are not very deferential. They call him ScoMo, Scott Morrison. His first comment was, in the comment was, well, I spoke to my wife about it. Why would you need to talk to your wife?
Oh my word. It's so interesting, isn't it? How people talk and the things they say. And you think, okay, so if we're going to find a moral compass, we know where to look.
Your wife. Not you.
It is so interesting, isn't it? And I think this is, again, it becomes part of the challenge, is that the language that we use can be so dismissive, and that's fundamentally how we communicate. So if we get our language wrong, then actually what that does is also silence other people, because that comment does not invite people to come forward. It does not enable them to think, oh, that's fine, if I've got an issue I can come forward and I'll be believed, because actually he felt the need to defer to his wife. So that means that inside himself is what? It's a question, but it's all of that signaling. And I think that's why, again, it's so difficult, that it's not just a kind of an individual thing. It's not just a family thing. Societally, we need to start getting our messaging right. We need to start talking about it in a way that enables people to feel they'll come forward and be heard and respected for their experience. And clearly, part of the challenge around all this is that if it then becomes a criminal matter, then it then becomes about finding the evidence, and that doesn't always work in a way that is respectful of experience, because it's trying to work out if the experience was there. And that again is just a completely different perspective than trying to go, we acknowledge your experience, because the investigation will go, well, we don't even know if your experience happened, and we need proof that it did. And that's completely different.
We'd better wrap it up on that note.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about what you do now.
What I do now? God, what do I do now? So I'm a coach.
Play the cello.
No, so I'm a coaching psychologist. So I've kind of gone from working more forensically to now working in a coaching space, which for me is, I actually just love it, because it's very future and very positive focused. And you can imagine, after working in the field of domestic abuse for 20 years, it can take its toll. And I felt the need to just do something that spoke more to my personal values. And for me, I've always been about trying, that whimsical notion of trying to make the world a better place. That's why the research I did for my PhD captivated me so much, because it was the potential to do that. It was that kind of, if I do this piece of research well, then victims will be better served, whatever the outcome. Because if the program works, great. If it doesn't, great. Then at least we know, and we can try and do something different. So for me, I think, the beauty of the pandemic was I got locked down for a year and took time to really evaluate what I wanted. And I knew things that were feeling a little off for me within my academic role. And I had trained as a coach. I brought coaching more into my workplace, which was a great thing to do. But what I really needed was the ability to work with people more directly. And so I left academia at the end of last year and set up my own coaching business. So I do coaching and consultancy. I'd still do consultancy around domestic abuse, because after 20 years, it's a difficult thing to completely break away from. And also it's so much of who I am. It would be ridiculous to go, oh no, I'm not talking about it, or working or consulting around those things. But I needed to find a kind of a positive balance to go with that. And so from my working as an academic in violence prevention, I'd worked a lot with other nonprofits, with third sector organizations. And one of my first coaching clients was somebody who led one of the organizations I'd partnered with years ago. And that was kind of what led me into coaching that group. And it was so lovely, because they kind of found me, really, rather than me having to think, oh, I need to work out who I'm going to work with. And I think because I share very, very similar values, all of those organizations still work on the basis that they're trying to make the world a better place. And I fundamentally get that. But I also understand that actually doing that can be, it's tireless. It's sometimes thankless. It can put you in some very, very difficult positions. But also, if you're leading that, the likelihood is that you are probably sacrificing a little bit of yourself along the way, but are unaware of it. So for me, I work in the space of going, okay, well, let's make sure that you have the impact that you want, but we're going to do that by making sure that you're looking after yourself, and that you have the kind of the emotional, psychological and coaching support to be able to be effective in your role, but also to make sure that you're prioritizing your own needs. Because if you don't, there will be no role, there will be no impact. For me, it's kind of that straightforward. We don't want you to burn out, because if you've burnt out, you've gone, and we can't have you not be here. So that's kind of what I do now.
And how can people get in touch with you?
So they can get in touch with me. Probably easiest way is through my website, which is www.thehopemakers.co.uk. I have a contact form through there, or they can email me at erica@thehopemakers.co.uk.
Thank you so much for today. It's been an absolute joy.
I loved it. Thank you so much for having me on.
And thanks for being so open, because it is a topic that it's being spoken about more, but it's not it's not a happy topic, shall we say. I think that's the best way of putting it.
No, it's not. And I think, people are it's one of those topics people don't know how to talk about. And even when I speak, I sit there and go, oh God, I can remember from my academic life, there are so many tensions within the field and arguments and debates about causes and all that kind of stuff, that it can be really difficult to feel as though you actually can say anything, because you feel that you're going to be shouted over. So clearly there will be somebody that comes back and will be like, oh, you got that wrong, or whatever. And I'm like, it's born on 20 years of experience. So, we'll see. But it's not a straightforward thing to talk about. It's really not. And it's not a straightforward issue, and it's complex and damaging, so it's hugely important that we do something about it. But also, I think, we're also a little bit scared to be innovative in that space too, because of the risk of doing something new that's unproven as well. So we need innovation, we need new ideas, we need new responses, but that always has to be managed against risk too.
Well, we don't like getting things wrong either, do we?
No, we don't.
Averse to getting things wrong.
We don't. We really are. Yeah, and quite rightly so. We don't want to do things that we know intentionally do things that we know are likely to fail. That would be ludicrous. But we do need to start to, I think a little bit differently. Just a small step away from where we currently are, that are grounded in a safe place, but just a little bit different, to see if we can start changing things.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Stay on the line, because I'll just say goodbye and then I'll say goodbye. Thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant, Erica. I really appreciate your time.
Oh no, it's been great.
Thanks for joining us this week on Menopause, Marriage and Motherhood. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite player, and while you're at it, we'd love you to leave us a rating on iTunes, or just tell a friend about the show. That would be amazing too. Be sure to tune in next week for the next episode. And remember, if you're busy thinking about what you can't have, how on earth are you going to enjoy what you can have?